Am I on the right now?
Yeah, you're about to be.
Good afternoon. I'm Chuck DeVore. I'm the Vice President of National Initiatives with the Texas Public Policy Foundation here in Austin, Texas. It's my distinct honor and great pleasure to have with us today the Attorney General of the great state of Texas, Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton was first elected to the office in 2014. He was reelected in 2018. And prior to that, he served in the Texas legislature, both in the Texas House and in the Texas Senate. So if you want to have someone who's an expert at both Texas elections and law and how elections are both run as well as how people might try to cheat on elections, there's no better expert than we could think of than General Ken Paxton. So with that, Attorney General Paxton, thanks for joining us today. And briefly, let's just launch off with the first question and get this thing kicked off right away. There's a lot of talk from people who are critics of efforts to crack down on any sort of election fraud or illegality, who say that it's very rare, that it really doesn't happen, that it doesn't actually affect elections. What do you say to that?
I just say they don't really know what they're talking about. First of all, most states don't do a very good job even dealing with this issue. They don't prosecute it. They don't focus on it. So we don't really even have a lot of data on how much election fraud is going on. All I can tell you is, as we've added prosecutors since I've been in the office, we started off with one when I was here. We're up to 3 with several investigators. They're all busy. And there are numerous cases that they can't get to because we don't have enough resources to dedicate to this particular issue. So I know there's voter fraud going. As to how much, I don't think anybody truly knows that answer, because most of it we don't discover, because most of it we don't investigate. And these cases take a long time to make sure that you've got them right and that you prove them. But I will say this: when I was in the Texas House and we were trying to pass voter ID, one of the arguments that the Democrats made on the floor was, we don't need to pass voter ID. The real problem is in mail-in ballot fraud. So they acknowledged at that time that we do have some significant voter fraud.
That's an interesting argument that they made about voter ID and mail-in ballot fraud. You're saying that at the time, they were saying that the big challenge was with mail-in ballot fraud. Let me ask you, I'm aware that in Texas, there are certain requirements, at least ideally, that when you go to the polls and vote in person, you're going to be asked to show some form of identification, or if not, there's some sort of a notation or consideration made. But when you vote through mail-in, is there any voter ID requirement at all?
Yeah, and that's one of the problems. You're bringing it up. We have photo ID requirement in Texas, which we passed in 2011, that allows voters to use certain types of photo ID, and that's certainly something voters are used to. They have to do it when they get on an airplane. They have to do it at a hotel. They have to do it, all kinds of places. You have to do it when you walk into a courthouse. So people are used to doing that. We passed that, and the reality is, with mail-in ballots, you don't have to do any of that. We don't know who's voting when we get a mail-in ballot. And I think that's the main reason that the legislature has limited it in Texas, is because they realize they are giving some concessions on reliability when they let anybody vote by mail-in ballot, but they don't open it up to everybody because they're not willing to concede that we're going to have a lot of voter fraud through mail-in ballots. And so I think it's a balancing act that the Texas legislature has tried to walk.
So coming as I do from California about 10 years ago now, so, a Texan by choice, not by birth, back in California, when we had mail-in ballots, the whole process, all ballots were simply called absentee ballots out in California. And it wasn't until I really started to dig into researching the challenges with mail-in ballots that I realized that there's technically a distinction between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. What is that distinction for our audience?
So absentee, you're basically saying you're not around to vote, and you're going to be out of the county, and so you're therefore going to vote absentee. you're allowed to mail in ballot for reasons like, you have a disability, some type of serious medical condition. You're allowed to do that if you're confined in prison, but you're not a felon. And you're allowed to do it if you're over 65. So, mail-in ballots are used sort of in conjunction with absentee, but absentee, you're actually literally saying you're not going to be in the county.
Interesting. So I know that there are certain groups that have been promoting a significant expansion of voting by mail. And interestingly enough, of course, they were promoting this prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then with the onset of the pandemic, they're saying, oh my goodness, we need to have universal mail-in balloting in Texas, regardless of what Texas election law says. Why do you suppose these groups were in favor of this prior to the pandemic and then simply doubled down and claimed that we really needed this because of the pandemic? What's going on here?
Look, I don't know the motivations for everybody wanting mail-in ballots, but what we need to recognize is there is this balance between election integrity and allowing more people to vote by mail, which presumably would make it easier for more people to vote. To have that balance right, I think you have to limit mail-in balloting to as few as necessary that need to do it, because otherwise we're not going to be able to trust our elections. And I would have to assume that some of the people that are pushing for that know that. I mean, because it's not surprising that they're less safe, and it's easier to grab somebody's mail-in ballot and turn it in. So, there are some people out there that clearly want mail-in ballots because they know it's easier to change election results and get what they want as far as who they want in office. So I think that's a concern the legislature has, certainly a concern I have. I think it's a concern that a lot of leaders have. Unfortunately, there are people who would like to use the system to make it easier to get their person in office and do it in a way that's not appropriate and that wouldn't recognize one man, one vote.
So if I remember my numbers correctly, about 8 years ago or so, approximately 1.5% of all the ballots in the 2002 general were voted through the mail, about 1.5%, if I recall correctly. In the 2018 general cycle, I think that went up to about 6.5%. So a pretty significant increase over that 6-year period from 2012 to 2018. If because of COVID and because of the promotion of mail-in ballots, let's just hypothesize, what if it went to 15 or 20% of all the ballots? Is the system in Texas even capable of handling a 4-fold increase in the number of mail-in ballots?
I think we're going to find out. In other states, that has been true, that they haven't been able to handle mail-in ballots. There are numerous stories from New York and Maryland and other states where they, encourage mail-in ballots and they haven't been able to handle them, count them appropriately, or know how to deal with them. So we have a concern here because every county has to deal with their own elections, and I'm not convinced that every county has the resources or the wherewithal to deal with this issue. So I am concerned, especially with that kind of massive increase. If that's the kind of increase we have, we could potentially have problems in some of our counties.
So if there's a genuine concern about health and safety because of the virus, what do you say to people about in-person voting and the perhaps increased likelihood of their vote being properly counted if they're voting in person, whether on election day or through early voting? Do you think that our voting centers are going to be, let's say, as safe as HEB?
I do. I think that for the most part, these county election officials are going to take this seriously. We've been dealing with this issue now for months and months. And everybody knows that we have guidelines from the CDC. We also are practicing social distancing. So I think you'll see them do what you see done at the HEB or the Kroger to protect people. People still go to the grocery store. They still go to the pharmacy. They still do other things. This is no different. You're doing it one time. It's not like you're going to the grocery store, which you may be doing, several times a week. This is a one-time vote in the next several months, and I don't think the risk is any higher than going to the grocery store, and it's just one of the risks that we have to deal with.
Interesting. So you've got this upcoming vote, and what's interesting to me is that we've seen now candidates or campaigns from both major parties in Texas send out mail-in ballot application forms encouraging people to either check the disability box or having the disability box pre-checked under the theory that fear of catching the virus constitutes a disability under Texas election code. We've also seen election officials in some of our major urban counties prepare to send mail-in ballot requests to large numbers of voters who didn't even ask for it. What do you think about this? And has your office done anything about what appears to me to be a violation of the Texas election code?
Well, we were sued over that very issue, fear of this being fear being a disability. Went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. We were successful in defending the law as it's written, which doesn't define disability as a fear of anything. It's an actual disability, actual physical condition that causes you some type of physical issue. So we won at the Texas Supreme Court. So any county election official or anybody else, anybody promoting the idea that fear satisfies the definition, that's clearly a violation of law, and it potentially subjects people to different types of punishments, potentially even criminal punishment. So I'd certainly not encourage people to say that fear of disability satisfies the disability box. And we continue to fight off efforts by county officials, particularly in Harris right now, sending mail-out ballots to everyone, people who don't even qualify, just sending it to everybody in the county, which clearly doesn't satisfy the requirements required by the legislature. So we're in that litigation right now, and I think in the end we'll be successful.
Good. You may know, of course, that here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we do a fair amount of original research. And one of the things that we've been working on is a statistical analysis of mail-in ballots over the last several election cycles. And I've been leading that effort. And one of the things that I've discovered as a former politician who's also used mail-in ballots as a tool in trying to win is that, as you may recall from a few minutes ago, we've seen this big increase in the percentage or the share of mail-in ballots as a total of the vote, moving again from about 1.5% to a little over 6% during the 2018 cycle. One of the things that our research uncovered was that there seemed to be statistical evidence in the 2018 cycle that the average age of those between the ages of 18 and 64, so in other words, under Texas law, as you know, General Paxton, if you're 65 and older, you automatically qualify for a mail-in ballot if you want one. But if you're under 65, you either have to check the disability box or you have to be out of town or in rare cases, voting from jail and otherwise eligible to vote. And what we found in the 2018 cycle was that the average age of people using the mail-in ballot in Texas dropped by 6 years. It went from 42 years old, which is where you would expect it to be, so the midpoint between 18 and 64, all the way down to 36 years old. And what that suggested to us as we were looking at this data further was that there are a lot of people who are checking the disability box and voting from home, not using it as an absentee ballot, but voting from home. Is this legal in Texas? In other words, how is the system even designed to potentially catch or discourage people who are inappropriately checking that box, whether it's the individual voter or a campaign or a third-party activist group?
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges of even having mail-in ballots is they're so hard to verify. And so if you have, as you suggested, more people doing it that are younger, who probably don't satisfy the disability box, it's really difficult when those ballots come in. There's no way to know that somebody is not telling the truth. So, I think the legislature this session is going to have to grapple with that problem, and hopefully, it's not too late to fix. And hopefully this election, we don't find out that we missed the vote and we have basically flawed elections.
So one of the challenges with universal vote by mail, and we saw this in California, you may be aware that in just prior to the 2018 voting cycle, California adopted the rules for mail-in ballots that Texas used to have, and Texas adopted the tighter rules that California used to have. So the two biggest states actually switched their rules on mail-in ballots. And the two main things that the big states switched were that in California, it used to be illegal to pay anybody to go out and try to harvest ballots, whether by the ballot or just even pay them in general to do ballot harvesting. And so Texas used to allow that. Now Texas doesn't. And California used to prohibit it, and now they allow it. And then the other thing that California changed was that in California, you used to have to be a relative of the voter if you were going to handle the ballot and turn it in for them. And now in Texas, of course, we tighten that up. You have to be a second-degree relative. Now, the reason why all this is important to lay out is that when you have a larger number of people who have ballots at their home, in other words, a large population voting from home, it makes them susceptible to being pressured by campaign workers who come door to door and try to persuade you or intimidate you or talk you into giving the ballot over to them or have them help you. And so that's the challenge with expanding this. And then there's one more thing perhaps you may want to comment on, which is that when you hear people say, oh, we need to expand mail-in ballots because of the virus, what would you say would happen if you have, let's say, an aggressive group of people out ballot harvesting who try to get into someone's home to help them with their ballot? Do you think that's going to be better or worse from the standpoint of COVID-19?
Well, there's no surprise to me that California is headed that direction, as you did. I lived out there as a kid, and it's sad to me to see the direction that state's going. And but it's also encouraging to me that Texans have figured out that this mail-in ballot initiative is not necessarily conducive to election integrity. And so tightening up the rules as it relates to who can help somebody fill out a mail-in ballot, I think is significantly helpful, although it still doesn't necessarily prevent other people from helping, because it's very difficult to prove that somebody else helped with a mail-in ballot. So I do think this is an ongoing issue, and that I think the Texas legislature is going to have to struggle with this balance between, accessibility and an election fraud. And whatever they do, they have to realize that the more we allow ballots outside of the normal voting process of showing up and identifying yourself, the more likely it is that our elections are going to be fraudulently conducted and less likely confident that we got the right people elected.
General Paxton, when you opened up, you talked about the expansion of the manpower, the resources that your office is dedicated to election integrity, saying that there was one individual in charge. Now you have 3 with additional investigators. Could you characterize 2 things for us? Could you talk about some of the criminal prosecutions that you've brought recently regarding election integrity? And if you're able to, could you characterize perhaps the extent or the nature of the current investigations that your office is engaged with?
So the nature of most of our cases right now, and have been over the last 10 years, about 66%, somewhere around there, are related to mail-in ballots. And that's, again, not surprising, because that's the easiest place to sort of game the system, if you want to be nice about it, cheating. And so we have prosecuted numerous cases over the last several years. We have people who have, tried to game the system. We had a mayor down in South Texas that we just indicted. We prosecuted a woman who had voted in numerous elections and she was not a citizen. Those investigations are not easy. They take a lot of time. And even with 3 prosecutors and a few more investigators than that, it takes significant resources to one, first find these cases, because we find very few of them because we just don't get the reporting that we need. Two, then to prove them, go out and get the information to give you a chance in court to show, because we don't want to prosecute people that haven't done anything wrong. We don't want to prove the case before we ever take it. And so it just takes a lot of effort to take it through the entire process. And so you're never going to see, thousands of cases coming out of an office that has 3 prosecutors. We probably have more than most states. And so it's limited in what we can do, but we try to send the message with what we do. And the fact that we're investigating, well over 100 cases right now, that we take this seriously and we're going to do our best. And you may be the unfortunate one that we catch.
Over 100 cases. That seems to be a significant increase from past efforts.
No, there's no doubt. We probably increased in the last 2 years. I think we've done more cases. We've investigated more cases and prosecuted more cases than had been done in the previous, 8 or 9 years. So we're making progress and hopefully getting the word out, because part of it is, deterrence. If people realize that we do have investigators, that we do have prosecutors, we aren't going to catch everybody, but we may catch you. Hopefully that encourages people or discourages people from doing things that are illegal.
So why do people cheat on elections? I mean, what's the whole point? Obviously, if you're going to go to this sort of trouble, there must be money involved. So why do people find it profitable to invest money in trying to fraudulently win an election? What is the prize? What do they get out of it?
Well, let's follow the money. People get paid to do it. And then if you get your person elected, they potentially can do things for you that others couldn't. And if they're getting in there in ways that are illegal, it wouldn't be surprising that they might be willing to do other things in office that are not appropriate and that may benefit those who have funded their campaigns, either legally or illegally. And so I think there's oftentimes there's some type of payoff or quid pro quo, and certainly that's not what we need as citizens. We want people elected because they want to go serve the people. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, take care of everybody.
So we talked earlier about the lack of any sort of identification requirements for voting by mail, other than just the signature match and the signature matching whatever's on file. What are some of the ideas that we can do to tighten that up? Has your office looked into what might be done to improve the integrity of mail-in ballots and reduce the likelihood of people inappropriately voting for someone else?
So we are looking at that. It's a challenging issue because it takes such enormous resources to verify when people are sending them in. It becomes very challenging to verify that they are the right people. I think the legislature is literally just going to have to sit down and say, we are either going to allow this to continue to go on, or we might have to reduce the ability to do this and make it easier for people to vote. Maybe providing more resources for longer periods of time to vote in person. And I know we already have 2 weeks, but maybe longer hours, maybe more voting locations, anything that allows us to encourage voting while at the same time ensuring that we get the right people voting, I would be in favor of.
We're seeing news reports from around the nation of certain states that have made a declaration that they're going to allow the receipt of mail-in ballots for days after the November 3rd election. How confident are you in the integrity of the elections here in Texas?
I think, we definitely have some issues, and I would not say I am 100% confident that every vote that gets cast is a vote that should have been made. I would say also that I think we are more secure than a lot of these states, particularly the one you talked about, California, that allows mail-in ballots for everybody. They don't even seem to be worried about or trying to deal with this issue. So I think we have a pretty secure election system in Texas, but I certainly think we could improve it, and I'm hopeful that in the next session, the legislature will seek to improve it so that we can be even more confident that the right people cast the votes and that the correct people are elected.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm quite concerned about some of the things that I've seen with, for example, just keeping that mail-in ballot period open. It would seem to invite the manufacturing of votes after the fact, which is obviously problematic. At this point, we'd like to go to some questions from our audience, General Paxton. Could you please explain the safe haven law for our federal elections? What is that?
So I'm actually not as familiar with the safe haven law because it's federally related. I don't know exactly how it relates to our Texas elections. So I have to defer that to somebody that knows federal law better than I do.
All right. So another question from a listener is that they received an unsolicited application for a mail-in ballot this week, pardon me, from their Texas representative. It was completely filled in with their information, and they're wondering, is that legal or valid?
You know, one of the things that we're trying to prevent right now is under Texas statutes, we have election officials in Harris County sending out unrequested ballots. I think private citizens can do that. The challenge is when you're an elected official and you're not given specific statutory authority to send those out, that's where we run into problems. I don't necessarily have a problem with candidates trying to get people to do mail-in ballots. That's been going on for years, but it's when we're using like tax dollars to do something that's not explicitly authorized by the legislature that we fall into, I think, troublesome waters.
Right. And my understanding is that we've seen in some jurisdictions these unsolicited applications that have gone out where the disability box has been pre-checked because they're going out to everybody. And I think another thing that we've seen is that some campaigns or third-party organizations have purchased lists from consumer information corporations, that sell lists of people who live at a certain address, they have a certain age, whatever. And so you end up seeing these applications coming in for people that haven't lived in an address for 10 years. And as we've seen in other states, we even see applications showing up for people's pets that were somehow listed on these consumer lists as a person rather than a pet. So what do you say to that? I mean, is there enough of a check in the system that if let's say a mail-in ballot request shows up to somebody who left the state 10 years ago, how confident are we that that person has been purged off of the voter rolls and that the person who received that request at that address might not try to vote for that person who no longer lives in Texas?
I have little confidence that that is not happening in cases across the state. I know, for example, my son has lived in California for the last 5-6 years. He still gets, his voting card. So it doesn't seem that difficult for if he somebody sent something in for him to get a mail-in ballot, not even being him, somebody to request it, and he'd be able to supposedly vote. So I think we've got some issues with the voter rolls. Clearly, because I've seen it in my own household. So clearly that's not the only problem in the state. So I do think that's another thing the legislature needs to take serious, is trying to figure out how to purge the voting rolls of people that no longer live here or deceased or shouldn't be on the voter rolls for some other reason.
So this question relates to that. The listener writes in, how do we as Texans demand that our voting system is cleaned up? Where do we start?
I think you got to start with your state rep and your state senator. They have the power to change the law. I don't. I enforce whatever the legislature gives me, whether I like it or not. It's my job to enforce the law. And I think the more people speak out on this and talk to their elected representatives, I think the better chance we have of addressing some of the problems that we have. We're never going to have a perfect system. We're never going to, end all illegal voting. But the more we think through this and tighten things up, like we did with the voter ID, I think that was a tremendous improvement. I think there's opportunities to improve mail-in balloting and tighten up this whole disability issue, which right now just, opens the door for a lot of people to check a box that we can't check. We can't know whether it's true.
So besides mail-in voting, what's the biggest threat to election integrity in Texas? I mean, you had indicated that something along the order of, I think you said 2/3 of your investigations are looking into irregularities or cheating with mail-in voting. Beyond that, what's the next biggest threat to election integrity?
I think we kind of hit upon it earlier, which is just the voter rolls not being accurate, that there's a certain percentage of people that shouldn't be on there, whether they're not legally citizens or whether they've moved or they're deceased. I think that is probably our next biggest issue to deal with. And I think that's one that could be dealt with much easier than trying to figure out this disability issue. I think that if there were the resources put into it, we could do a better job especially with the technology that we have available today. There's no reason we shouldn't have close to 100% accuracy on who is eligible to vote and not allow people beyond that voting.
Are you aware of have you heard any numbers from the Secretary of State as far as the number of files that they try to look at in a given cycle based on inactive voters? Is it 50,000? Is it 250,000? Do you have any idea what sort of scale we're looking at?
No, I actually don't know the absolute numbers that they look at every year. I assume they're doing their best with the resources they have, but clearly there needs to be more thought put into this and more resources, because we don't have it. We definitely don't have it down right now.
I understand that there's a program that supposedly requires or at least encourages counties to notify the Secretary of State when, for example, somebody gets called up for jury duty and then checks the box on the little postcard that they return saying, well, I can't be on jury duty because I'm not a citizen. And supposedly that results in some sort of a check with the voting rolls to ensure that that person is not registered. Is there any effort to potentially sanction people legally for that? I mean, it certainly is problematic for me to think that there could be people who could be called for jury duty and then say, well, I shouldn't, I shouldn't be eligible for the jury duty because I'm not a citizen. And then you find out that they're registered to vote. I mean, are there any sanctions for that?
It's difficult to find because we don't often know that people are registered to vote who are not citizens. Believe it or not, it's happened. It's continuing to happen, and I think that's another thing the legislature needs to think through. How can we more thoroughly vet people before they've signed up to vote? Seems like we have the technology. We should have the technology to be able to do that relatively easily. It's just a matter of the legislature making that a priority, so that we shouldn't have a single non-citizen voting in any of our elections, but clearly we do.
So I know that as Attorney General for the state of Texas, you occasionally meet with your counterparts from around the country. This question relates to that. Are there any states that you've seen that you think are handling the issue of election integrity well, and that we might be able to look at as a model? And have you learned anything of interest from your counterparts in the other states?
It's interesting. Texas tends to be the model in most of these types of issues. I think we'll continue to be the model. Mostly what I've learned from other states about election integrity is what not to do, not so much what to do. And looking at states like California, where it appears that mail-in ballots can be leveraged so that one party can control power forever, because you can always send out more mail-in ballots to more people and have more illegal votes or votes that shouldn't be part of the system. So I guess seeing what goes wrong in other states has been motivation for us and for me to seek to make sure that our state doesn't go the wrong direction.
So another question from a viewer: how closely does your office work with the Texas Secretary of State on election issues?
So they have a lot of discretion. They deal with election issues. We are their counsel. So typically, we get involved when they ask for our help on particular either litigation or legal issues. But we don't run that place. They have their own, appointed person by the governor, and their job is to deal with elections and election integrity. And our job is to represent them when they have legal issues or litigation.
The legislature is due to convene for its biennial session in January. Do you expect that they're going to address voting practices, and do you see any changes that you see them making?
Yeah, I think they've seen what's going on nationally. There's clearly an effort nationally to use mail-in ballots. It's been an onslaught, and definitely a strategy that the Democrats are using across the nation, because it's not random that nearly every state is dealing with the same issue. I think there are like 18 states that have litigation going on related to some type of election issue right now. So I think the legislature, surely they've noticed this as well as we have, and we've talked to some of them, and I think there's going to be some effort this session to tighten things up and to make sure that our elections are fair and free and people have access, but at the same time we know that they're not conducted with fraud.
I know that when the motor voter law passed, as I recall, during the Clinton administration, and connected voter registration with the driver's license applications, there was, as part of that law, as I recall, a consideration for how frequently the voter roll should be purged, although there's some degree of an argument over whether the two election cycles that I think the law mentions insofar as inactivity are two election cycles, at the national level, in other words, 8 years, or whether they're two election cycles, including the off-year elections, meaning then 4 years. Is it possible, given that federal law, to purge voter rolls yearly if the legislature passes a law to that effect, or are we limited to some degree by federal law?
Yeah, I think the way I remember that being drafted is that doesn't stop states from doing more, but it's sort of a ceiling on how long your voter rolls can go without being looked at or purged of people who shouldn't be on there. So I think that states can do more than that. They can make it less than 8 years or 4 years. They could do it 2 years if they have the technological capability of doing it. I mean, what would be the reason for preventing a state from purging its rolls, if they could do it every month, of people who shouldn't be on the rolls?
There's been some arguments generally on the left that any form of voter identification is somehow a voter suppression effort. What do you say to people who are critical of voter ID laws, that there are individuals who either don't have an identification or find it difficult to find an identification? What sort of provisions does Texas make for those individuals? And what is the status of current lawsuits regarding that issue?
Well, so it's unfortunate to say that when we're trying to deal with election integrity and making sure that the right people vote, the people that are allowed to vote by law, that's suppression. I guess you could call that suppression, but it's it's very pejorative and very negative. But the reality is that's what we're supposed to do. We don't want everyone voting that the law doesn't allow to vote. So it's something that we're supposed to be doing, and these are laws that the elected representatives have passed. And to put that in a negative light is unfortunate, and I think wrong, because in the end, everybody should have a fair right to vote under the law, and anybody suggesting any differently that shouldn't be done, they want it changed. They need to come to the legislature and get it changed.
What do you say to those voters that are concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic insofar as voting in person? What are the safe alternatives to an all-mail ballot here in Texas?
Well, I think you're going to see more time allowed for voting. Certainly that was true in the recent elections. It spreads out voters. I mean, the thing that we're often dealing with is just overcrowding, people not being socially distant. I think you're going to see, we've all been trained and we know what social distancing is. And I think you'll see most counties, hopefully all counties, practicing CDC guidelines and making sure that people are part. And I also think you'll see more of these voting locations that you can vote from your car, where they'll bring the voting machine out to you. But either way, they can be made relatively safe. And again, you're doing this once. It's not like going to the grocery store where you're risking your health every time you walk in. And people, as we know, people do what they have to do, and that's there's no different in this case.
Bring the voting machine out to the car, so that, I guess, truly would be motor voter. I hadn't heard of that concept before.
Yeah, they've done it in the past for people that are disabled that can't get out. They'll bring it out to you. Now, every location is different. I'm just saying that that's one possible alternative. It's certainly not something we can do for everybody at this point, but it is something that I think you'll see more of.
Do you think that Texas should end the practice of allowing any candidate or organization to send mail-in applications?
It's a good question. I think it certainly should be debated. I'm not sure I know the answer to that as I'm sitting here. It certainly should be debated and discussed. I'd love to hear the arguments on both sides. I think there's definitely a debate to be had about whether that does increase the likelihood of fraud. It probably does. And we just need to figure out in this political process whether it's worth it to have that type of opportunity for candidates, based on knowing that we're going to have some voter fraud related to it.
So as we've seen around the country during these primary elections, we've seen some pretty extraordinary races. For example, in Paterson, New Jersey, where I think something on the order of 20% of mail-in ballots were either disqualified or there was something wrong with them. We've seen that in other states as well, West Virginia, where large numbers of ballots either never make it to the voter, or if the voter fills them out, never make it back, or are rejected because the signatures don't match or there's something wrong with the ballot itself. Should we be concerned about the fact that mail-in voting seems to have a unacceptably high failure rate relative to voting in person?
Yeah, I'm extremely concerned about it, especially as so many states have embraced this idea of universal mail-in ballots, or at least expanded it. It is going to call into question, and I think one of my concerns about election day, it's going to call into question any election that we have, and make people wonder whether we got the right person, whether it's the president or U.S. Senate or whatever, local DA. So it is unfortunate that we've used this COVID experience to massively expand something that we should know from experience doesn't have the same reliability.
I know that the vast number of employees of the U.S. Postal Service are professionals. I know many of them are veterans. However, it is also true, if I remember correctly, that the U.S. Postal Service Union has formally endorsed a candidate for president. And I know that back in the days when I was running for partisan office in California, it was always a concern when you would deliver your bags of election mail to really double check, triple check that it actually got out into the mail trucks for delivery. Because sometimes Postal Service employees would play partisan favorites. Do you see that as a potential problem when it comes to mail-in ballots? By that, I mean, if you have, let's say, an area that is overwhelmingly of one party or the other, that mail-in ballots from that location might be treated differently than they might be treated in a different location that had party registration or party affiliation in greater numbers than a different neighborhood.
Absolutely. This is another concern with mail-in ballots. When you go to the polls, you get to vote right there. It's all done right, and there's no distribution system. With mail-in ballots, not only do we have concerns about other people filling them out, but we also have some concerns about the distribution system and whether, as you said, one employee here or there may do something with mail-in ballots that they shouldn't. It's certainly a possibility, and it opens the system up to less security not just in what we talked about, but in as we're talking about now in the distribution system. There's no doubt with as many ballots that are going to be coming in by mail-in that we're going to have some problem with distribution, either by purposeful intervention or maybe even by accident.
Regarding mail-in ballots, do you see additional protections that might be required or could improve the integrity of the mail-in ballot system in Texas regarding identification? Is there something that could readily be done beyond simply signature verification?
You know what? We're pretty creative, and technology is advancing. I don't have anything off the top of my head other than trying to find a way to narrow what people can check as a box when there's no way to verify it. But I think there's a lot of creative people out there, and I think this is one of those things, if you open that up to the legislative process and debate, that we might come up with some ideas that allow us still to do some of this mail-in balloting, but do it more safely. If not, I think the legislature needs to seriously consider figuring out some other way to verify these mail-in ballots.
So last question, General Paxton, if you look at the upcoming election on November 3rd and presume that all across the country there's going to be a significant increase in the use of mail-in ballots, as well as in Texas, what do you see as the potential implications on election night and knowing who the victor is going to be, and how might that play out over the weeks and potentially months between Election Day and Inauguration Day in January?
Well, I'm extremely concerned because with more mail-in ballots, you open it up to more questions about the validity of your elections. And so whoever loses is going to question mail-in ballots. It almost goes without saying. And so I'm not sure that we're going to know on Election Day or even days after who the victor was. And I'm concerned. I'm one of the co-chairs for Lawyers for Trump, that we're going to be spending a lot of time and money and effort and resources litigating issues that really we shouldn't have had to litigate, but for the fact that we've become so liberal on how we use mail-in ballots.
General Paxton, is there anything else that you wanted to say to our viewers at this time on this topic, or anything else?
Well, I just say this is not a time to not be engaged. This is a time to pay attention, to go vote, and to make sure that as we're going into a legislative session, that your voice is heard on these types of issues. Because if we can't have fair elections and we can't know that we can trust that the elections were fair, then our governing people don't have credibility, and it will fundamentally affect the way our democracy and our republic work. So I just encourage people to vote and to be involved in the process, because we need you.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Attorney General Ken Paxton. Very much appreciated, given your busy schedule, to talk about this very important topic for the state of Texas and for the people of the state of Texas. If individuals watching this live stream want to learn more, the Election Protection Project, we have a Facebook page here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, as well as a newsletter. And we would encourage you to sign up to learn more about this topic and others, and also discover what more you might be able to do to help promote election integrity in the state of Texas. I'm Chuck DeVore. And again, thank you so much for watching this live stream with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Good afternoon.